Hey, welcome to Adventures in Angular, the podcast where we keep you updated on all things Angular related. This show is produced by two companies, Top End Devs and Envoy. Top End Devs is where we create top end devs who get top end pay and recognition while working on interesting problems and making meaningful community contributions. And Envoy provides remote design and software development services on a task basis, so clients only pay after the tasks are delivered and approved. In today's episode, we will talk about ngDemo and just overall testing practices on Angular applications. My name is Lucas Paganini. I'm your host in the podcast, and joining me in today's episode is a very special guest, Matt. Matt, let me know if I butcher your surname, but I believe it would be pronounced Rabel. Is that it?
That's correct.
Awesome. Got it right. Nice. So Matt is a web developer and author of the Angular Mini Book, a practical guide to developing apps with Angular and Spring Boot. And as part of this book and the content that he produces, he created, he has a repository which is called ngDemo, and it's a demo application using some of the latest versions of Angular. And he also set up automated testing in this repository. So what we're going to try to talk about more in here is how did he set up automated testing in this repository and some of the different ways in which Angular developers are doing testing nowadays, because we have the native Angular modules for doing testing, but we also have Cypress, we have Playwright, we even have Storybook still that allows us to test individual components. And there are some other companies and tools such as AiA tools. So this is kind of the overall intro for those of you that might be interested. Stick to it, and we're going to start going deeper into that topic now. So Matt, just so that we can start out, first off, thank you for taking the time to be here in the show. I really appreciate you being here. And let's just give people an introduction on how things are structured on ngDemo in terms of automated testing.
So in ngDemo, it basically just has unit tests for components, and they're very simple, right? They basically don't really do much except verify that the component's been instantiated, right? But that's very helpful to know if you have any errors in your component. And then there is a service test as well, because there's basically a service that calls out to get like a list of people that are rendered in the UI. And so in that test, there's more like mocking that happens, right? Of like the HTTP request and verifying, that certain data comes back. And then there's also end-to-end tests, which are driven with Cypress. And for the most part, the ngDemo app is very boring or simple, right? Because I call it like the bare bones, basically Angular app, Angular tutorial. And Cypress is just verifying that the functionality works, right? It has a list screen of happens to be Denver Nuggets players, in the NBA, and you can, click on them and edit them, or you can add a new one. And that's it. And it's just talking to a JSON file. It uses like in-memory storage, so it's not talking to an actual database. Versus like the Angular mini book shows you how to talk to an Angular data or a database in the back end with Spring Boot. And so that Cypress test is very simple, but there's also GitHub Actions that show how you can automate it with CI. And then there's different branches for Angular material. There's one for Bootstrap, there's one for Auth0, and there's one for Electron. So it kind of, verifies like with Auth0 that you can actually log in, right, to an application. And so, a lot of that's just to show you the bare bones that you need for testing infrastructure.
Awesome. Okay. Well, one thing that I think we can create a distinction for people just to get started on this discussion is the different types of things that we're going to be testing, right? Because if you're just testing logic, like for example, pure functions, then my approach is always going to be just writing regular unit tests. And that can be with Jasmine, that can be with Jest, I don't care, like whatever comes with the framework that I'm using. So I know that nowadays it's much easier to use Jest with Angular. NX, for example, allows you to very easily run Angular tests using Jest instead of Jasmine, which used to be the default test runner for Angular. So nowadays we have this option. But if you're using Jasmine or Jest, I really wouldn't mind because their syntax is pretty much the same and they do the same thing. So if you're just going to test pieces of your logic, so for example, function X should receive those arguments and return that value, then just write regular unit tests. Don't even bother with the framework. So at least myself, I try to isolate the parts of my application that are not framework specific and really make them not framework specific. Like everything that is just a business logic, I try to not make it too coupled with Angular and just have regular pure functions that declare this business logic and just test those individual units. But then for anything that requires me to interact with the front end, then I'm not going to shy away from using Angular. And in those scenarios, that would become a service, right? So that's either going to be a service or an injectable function, right? So a function that runs within an injection context in Angular. And in such scenarios, then I would still write a regular Jest or Jasmine test. But then, of course, I would have to use the test bed from Angular so that I can declare the service as a provider in there. And then I can get an instance of the service to run tests against it. So that would be the only difference. But when it comes to visual testing, so when it comes to actually testing a component, for example, an accordion. So let's say that when you click on the toggle, it should expand and show the main content of the accordion. And when you click on the header again, it should collapse. For those things, my current approach is to not write Angular tests for that. And what I would rather do is just write an end-to-end test for the main crucial flows of the application. And I would do that using either Cypress or Playwright. So I would not be testing the accordion itself. I would not be testing that the accordion expands and collapses. I would just be testing a flow that perhaps uses the accordion. So it would be tested as a byproduct. But the test wouldn't be about the accordion. It would be about a user flow that just happens to use the accordion, right? So the downside of that is that I have less coverage of my components because I'm not really testing all the different things that the accordion component could do. But the good thing about this is that I'm testing what actually matters to the users, right? Which is that they are able to complete their actions. So there's a downside there, but to me, it just feels faster. It felt that all the times in the past that I tried to write component tests in Angular, like using the test bed, instantiating the component, simulating interactions, like clicking on the header and seeing if the content appears, I think that it didn't felt natural. I wasn't really testing it how the users would test it. So these are the ways in which I'm approaching testing currently. I would be very curious to know how you're approaching it conceptually. So just to summarize, I separate the things that I test between functionality and presentation. For functionality, if I can make it as simple as a pure function, then that's what's going to be. And then I just use Jest or Jasmine to test it. If I really need the Angular framework, then I turn it into a service or an injectable function. And then I use the Angular test bed to provide and instantiate that in order for me to test. And that's the logic side of things. Whenever I create something for presentation, so an actual component, then I'm not currently writing unit tests for those components. What I do is I just write end-to-end tests with either Cypress or Playwright that test flows in which that component might or might not be used. But yeah, how do you approach this, Matt?
But I think your approach is correct because a lot of times unit tests should be testing logic, right? And if you have components that just don't have a lot of logic in it, then you're probably writing unit tests to test the framework. And if you're using a framework, you should pretty much trust that that framework works, right? And so I think your approach is good there. I think the beauty of end-to-end tests is they can be used for your app, especially if you're migrating from one thing to another. I know, ThoughtWorks has had a lot of consulting around micro front ends and migrating from Angular JS to like React, right? So just a portion of the page has like React on it, or maybe it has, the new version of Angular instead of Angular JS. So by having those end-to-end tests, you can help migrate, from one framework to another, or one concept to another. And it's not just, verifying that the UI comes up correctly. And so JHipster is a project that I work on, an open source project that we use Jest instead of Jasmine. And Jasmine is used in my NG demo because it's just bare bones, right? I'm not trying to use anything, outside of Angular. And we have like 70%, 80% coverage on all of the components, but we're also generating the code, right? So when you generate code, you want to make sure that they're tested well. And so that one is a bit more unit test heavy, but if you look at the components in there, there's a bit more logic in them than my bare bones example. And then as far as like end-to-end tests, I think it's good to have CI that's verifying everything works, but I spent a lot of times in my career like babysitting CI, I call it, because it has false positives. And in fact, on the JHipster project, when we were using Protractor before Cypress existed, we would have failures all the time that you couldn't reproduce locally. And so we basically saw Protractor as a burden, right? And migrating to Cypress really helped us a lot. But I think, front-end developers typically don't write as many tests, in my experience, as back-end developers. But I think what you need to remember is that if you're not writing tests, you're just not automating things that you're doing already. Because as a front-end developer, you'll be testing out the UI all day manually, and you can really speed up your workflow if you use, end-to-end tests or something similar to basically automate it. But it's never going to replace like the visual kind of testing, right? Because one experience that we had in JHipster was, we upgraded the latest version of Bootstrap, and all of a sudden, like the red buttons and the blue buttons had black text on them. And our CI would have never caught that, right? Because we're not getting that to a granular level. And then we found out we had a style sheet that was overriding the default of white text on a, blue background. So I still think even though end-to-end tests are great, you still kind of want maybe a human involved or some sort of visual testing framework involved.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a very good point. Is if you're testing components the same way that you're testing logic, then um you're not gonna see, right? Like
Right.
you're literally not seeing what the component is doing. And thus, if a color changes or if something is rendered in a different position as where it should be, then your test is probably not gonna get that. You could write a test using protractor or something like that to test this, I guess, but it would be more effort than using tools that have visual regression tests. And that's where we start leaning on some of the solutions that exist nowadays to facilitate component testing, which, to be perfectly clear, I have not explored long enough to tell the audience like, oh, hey, I tried this and you can go this direction. So I really don't know. But I think it's interesting for us to at least tell the audience what exists nowadays, right? So I know that Cypress component testing is a very easy option nowadays. They even have native support for Angular components. So if you go to the Cypress docs and you go to component testing, there's an overview there with a very basic example of how you would test an Angular component. And it's just so easy to follow along with the test implementation. Really very easy to understand how the test is written and what it's doing, what it's testing. So Cypress does seems to be getting this right, at least when you look at the docs, right? When you actually start writing the tests, maybe it becomes more complicated than how it looks in this very simple example in here. But it's nice that they do have an API dedicated for testing components, and they already have native support for Angular. But then we also have a very established alternative already for component testing, and not just component testing, um, but also, how can I say, deploying or previewing components, right? Which is Storybook. So it's been a while since people talk about Storybook. It's not a hot topic anymore. It was a few years ago, but Storybook already has a test runner, and with their task runner, you can do interaction tests, you can do accessibility tests, you can do visibility tests. And that all comes with a tool which was already designed specifically for dealing with individual components, right? So by using Storybook, you also get that nice application that you can deploy and allow your designers to play around with the components to see if it's how they envision them. So that's definitely a tool that I would also consider, because it seems that it was built specifically for this. Whereas Cypress wasn't really built for components, right? It was built for end-to-end tests. And now they are also allowing us to use it to test components, but originally wasn't built for this. I wonder, Matt, have you ever explored some of those options? Maybe you have others that you know that exist that we could at least tell the audience so they can research more?
But I have heard of Storybook, and I've, helped like edit and publish blog posts about it at my previous job, but also it was also in a React context. So until today I wasn't even aware that you could use it with other frameworks, but I also think a lot of times the reason we might not be using something like Storybook is a lot of times I'm developing apps, right? And testing apps. I'm not developing components and testing components. Like, I think if you're a company that has a component library, you might be using Storybook more because you have designers that are like interacting with that library and trying to make it work. But I think what you've seen in the Angular ecosystem is a lot of libraries are open source as well, right? And so it's typically a small team of developers trying to make something happen. It's not more established like a company would be with a design system and docs that document how everything works, and use something like Storybook and its testing feature to verify everything works. I think that's a more formal system, and us developers are more used to just getting down and dirty with the code and making it work that way, especially with app development versus component like library development.
Yeah, that does make sense. I also didn't knew that Storybook worked with other frameworks until a few months ago when I decided to. Well, actually, it was because I saw that NX had an add-on for it, and NX was originally created in a very Angular-centric context. So I just thought it was interesting when I saw Storybook inside NX. And then I saw that they actually do support other frameworks. They actually support not just React and Angular, but many others. Like if you just go to their website now, I believe that they support Vue as well. Yep. So React, Vue, Angular, Svelte as well. So that's pretty interesting. Seems that they really expanded their support. Even native web components is something that they're also supporting at this point, which is
Nice.
pretty cool.
I was going to ask about Svelte because, I'm primarily a Java developer most of my days, right? And I also am one of the few Java champions that likes JavaScript and TypeScript. And so it's very interesting for me that in the JavaScript world, we have Angular, React, Vue, and Svelte, and they've been around for almost a decade now, right? But in the Java world, maybe it's the same in the .NET world. There's always jokes about a new JavaScript framework, every week or every day or whatnot. And it really hasn't happened for a long time. So it's funny that those jokes still exist and that perception still exists when it's not really true.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. I'm really amazed at the amount of tools that a few years ago only existed for React, and slowly they are expanding to work with other frameworks as well. It's really nice to see that we from the Angular community are getting support for more tools. Still, there are lots of things that I wish existed in Angular that are currently just React specific. So, just one quick example that comes to mind is Radix, Radix UI. It's a headless components that you can style, and it really saves a bunch of time. So, there are some things like it for Angular, but there isn't a Radix UI implementation. And also, I think Framer is a design tool which is similar to Figma. And as far as I'm aware, it allows you to drag and drop React components into it, but it doesn't work with other types of frameworks, only React components.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if there is more support from these tools for Angular, because there's kind of an Angular renaissance happening now, right? Where it's adding more features. It's not just upgrading and becoming faster. And now there's even the talk of combining it with Wiz, right? Like that's happening at Google, which is what I think powers YouTube or something like that. So it's more performance based. And so I think you will see Angular get faster. And then React isn't really a framework. It's just a UI kind of, you know, framework, right? It's you have to pull in Redux and everything else to like make it a full-on framework. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years, right, like Angular starts to be more popular. And a lot of that's because, you know, we're getting newcomers into the field and they don't have this legacy of one is better than the other. They just want to learn something and get a good job, you know?
Yep, definitely, definitely. Mm, interesting, interesting. Okay, so currently, just recapping, if you were nowadays to start an application from scratch, an Angular application, what would you explore in terms of tools for testing? Would you, so end to end, for example, would you go straight to Cypress or would you explore Playwright? I heard there's another one called Apply Tools. I'm not sure if it's end to end or component testing, but I believe it's end to end.
So most of my experience with Apple Tools is just because I had someone I admire work there, which is Angie Jones. Now she's at TBD or Block, right, or uh, Cash App, like that whole company, Square, and all that. But I believe it was a visual testing framework, so I tried to make it work on a blog that we had that basically showed how you would, you know, use like macros and stuff to spit out a bunch of instructions on how to like log into Okta kind of thing. And so I wanted to basically verify that, you know, if anyone changed these certain files, like all the instructions would still render. So I believe Applet Tools is good at that. I just never got it working, right? But the whole point is like it will notify you if visual regressions take place. And so as far as you're asking about the tools I would choose, a lot of times if it's a full stack app, I would just use what JHipster has, right? Because JHipster uses like Jest for unit testing, uses Cypress for end-to-end tests, and we've had a lot of luck with that using GitHub Actions. Um, and if it's Vue or React, we have support for that as well. So as you know, primarily an Angular person, I can look if I'm on a React project and see how JHipster is doing it. Like I don't have to use JHipster for the app. I can just generate apps with it and see like the code it's generating. So that's very helpful. And a lot of times, you know, people, especially enterprises, aren't creating brand new Angular apps, right? They have an existing app that they want to replace part of, right? So a lot of times you don't get like the green field where you can pick all the different tools you might use. I mean, it might be, you know, there's a team that runs the back end and the back end is PHP or Java or .NET, and they choose Playwright because they have experience with that. And so you might not get a choice to use Cypress, right? The corporate standard is Playwright. So I think you kind of use what's available depending on the project. Now, if you're developing your own thing, it's a whole different ballgame, right? You get to choose, but a lot of times you will end up with a team, and then you might have to choose from that team's expertise. As far as Playwright is concerned, I haven't actually used it. I believe it's a Microsoft product, but we did have an issue in the JHipster project where people were like, let's explore this, let's compare it to Cypress, and let's implement it so give our users a choice whether they want to use Cypress or Playwright. And it basically never got off the ground. So the main person that was interested in it never found the time. I don't know if they had small kids or whatnot, but that often takes people's after hours.
Gotcha. Okay. And by the way, you mentioned JHipster, but I don't think we gave a description to the audience of what JHipster is.
So JHipster started as an Angular JS front end generator, and back end was in Spring. And then Spring Boot came along in 2014, and we kind of adopted that. And we've kept up with Angular over the years, right? So we started with Angular JS, and now it's on Angular 17. And so it's basically an application generator, full stack app. And with Spring Boot, you can package it in a jar, they call it in Java land. So it's a single artifact that has your whole application that can be running front end in Angular, back end in Spring Boot. And it can also do microservices and micro front ends. So if you want to have multiple microservices spread out because you have different teams working on different components, then you can do that. And the cool thing with micro front ends is those front ends can be a part of that microservice. And then there's a gateway that has, a shell that pulls in all those micro front ends using module federation. And so it's a cool project. It's been around for 10 years. I wrote a book on it. I was like the lead security engineer for the last 6 years, and I recently became like a project lead. But that just means I'm doing releases now. So hopefully those will happen more. But it's been a fun way of showing people what the cutting edge is in Java land and, with the JavaScript frameworks.
Gotcha. Cool. Okay. Matt, I think we can start wrapping up. The time went flying, but we're almost at 30 minutes of content at this point. I'm really happy with anyone that stick with us talking about testing for so long. Testing tends to be a somewhat boring topic. So it's interesting that we were able to extract so much from it. And at least to me, it has been a very valuable discussion. I really like some of the points that you brought up. And it's also nice to see that you're testing it the same way as me conceptually. So that gives me some more insight that, okay, perhaps I'm in the right track. Like other people that I didn't knew are doing the same thing. So that's always good news. Before we start wrapping up, I want to make sure that we haven't not touched on anything that you consider to be super important. So my question to you is kind of like a catch-all question. Is there anything that you think is really relevant about this subject of testing that I haven't asked, I haven't touched upon, but you think we should talk about? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, there's two things. One is code coverage, and the other is clean code. So code coverage, I mean the percentage of, the main application's code that has been covered by tests. A lot of times you'll meet people that want 100% code coverage, which is a lot of times ridiculous, right? Because especially in the Java world, you have what we call POJOs, or plain old Java objects, and they're just an object with getters and setters, right? And there's not much reason to test those because they're going to work, right? And so I think test coverage, a lot of times, I think 70 to 80% is a good goal. And beyond that, you're probably just, writing meaningless tests that really don't do much but boost your test coverage. And so that's what we kind of aim for in JHipster is, between 70 and 80%. Also clean code. The reason I mention that is we use Sonar to test the sample apps that we can generate and verify that there isn't security issues or just, known things in TypeScript or JavaScript or Java that you might do. And so Sonar and Sonar Cube is very useful for that. Can run in a Docker container if you want to do it locally, but we use Sonar Cloud, and we fix issues between every release, because we get these alerts that, hey, this code might have vulnerabilities or might have issues. And so I think, not being so focused on testing it for every release, but it's just handy to know that you can improve your code with tools like that.
Nice. Great additions. Thank you. Yeah, so now let's start wrapping up. Matt, I would love to let you do the first round of promos. So that's just a section in the show where we shamelessly plug whatever we're working on or things that we would like people to be aware of. So what would you like to promote?
So I'm on GitHub at mraible, MRAIBLE, and that's where you can find my NG demo app. Another one that's popular on there is my JHipster 8 demo, which is just a tutorial where I show you how to get started with JHipster. And then also 21 Points is another repo that is part of my JHipster mini book. And that's a full stack app that shows you how to basically monitor your health. It's built with Angular and Spring Boot, and you basically get 3 points a day for eating well, not drinking, and exercising, so you can get 21 points in a week. So that was a fun sample app that I created that you can not only find at 21-points.com, but also you could, clone it from GitHub and use it that way. I'm also mraible on LinkedIn, Twitter, pretty much everywhere.
Awesome. Okay. I'm just going to plug the two companies that produce the show, so Top End Devs and Envoid. If you're looking for more content about software development, Top End Devs has several podcasts, so you can check out some of the other shows that they have about React, DevOps, machine learning. There's a lot of topics that might be interesting for different subjects inside software engineering. And if you're a company or an individual that knows someone that wants help to build their product, so definitely check out unvoid.com. This is unvoid.com. And they are basically a software and design consultancy. So you can outsource your software and development services to them. But what makes them different from other companies that do the same is that whereas with other companies you would pay by the hour, and then the professionals are incentivized to take up longer to deliver the tasks, with Unvoid, you actually only pay after the tasks are delivered and approved. So you have predictability on your costs and on your quality, because you know beforehand how much each thing is going to cost. And you also know that this thing is going to be up to your quality standards. Otherwise, they're not going to approve and they're not going to get paid. So it's a very interesting model that puts all the risk to their side and leaves the client happy to sleep at night knowing that everything is going to be on track in terms of quality and budget. So yeah, definitely check out unvoid.com if you're interested in that. Again, thank you so much for sticking with us up until the end. I hope you have a great week. Matt, thank you so much for being with us, and I will see you in the next week.